Good morning. A special welcome to those of you who are joining us online today. We're glad that you've joined us this way as well. The house that we raised our children in, we've not lived in it for about 10 years ago, but when they were growing up, the house that we lived in had this beautiful maple tree in the backyard. It was about the height of our two-story house. It was a large, old tree. In the spring, the leaves would be red. In the summer, they would turn to green. In the fall, they would turn to red again, and then they would all fall, and we would have hours and hours of enjoyment of raking to do. And when the kids were little, we'd be raking the leaves. They'd be in these piles. The kids would jump in them and flop around in them, and we would take all kinds of pictures. But this tree kind of became the focal point of our backyard. When the kids were really little, we had a little kid swing in it, and we'd put them in it, and they'd play in it for hours. As they got older, we had a swing made from a tire that looked like a horse, and they enjoyed this so much. Kids from the neighborhood would come on up and play in our yard. And one year we even decided that we were going to tap the tree and see if we could make maple syrup. So we got a spigot, we put it in the tree, and the tree produced just gallons of sap. And so we had this pot boiling in our kitchen for what felt like 3 straight days, peeling the wallpaper off, ruining the room completely. In fact, at the end, we got to the point where we said, I think it only needs like a little bit more time. Let's watch a movie. While we watched the movie, it boiled down to some hard, solid thing that I think we had to throw the pot out. We absolutely ruined it. But this tree became kind of the focal point of our backyard. It was kind of just always there. We took family pictures in front of it. Well, I saw a picture of this tree. We haven't lived in the house for 10 years now. I saw a picture of our tree in our old house in a brochure the other day. And it was a picture on a brochure for a company that cuts down trees. And I said, this is our swing tree. This is like the family picture tree. This is the tree that kind of our kids grew up climbing and playing in. And now it's been reduced to firewood. And this is what life is like. This is the theme of Ecclesiastes. This is what we talked about last week, that there are seasons for things. There's a season for things to start, and then there's a season where it's over and you get chopped up and made into firewood. There's a season where things begin, and then there's a season for them to finish. And if you thought that's a depressing message, you should have been here last week when we talked in chapter 1 and 2, where the writer says that life is meaningless. Life is like chasing after the wind. It's like vapor or mist or a mirage. Think of a mirage on a hot day. You're looking at a long road ahead of you, and if you look really closely, it looks like there's water on the road. Beautiful, refreshing water. And if you were to chase after that and go get it and drive further down the road to try to find it, and then you stop and you get out, all you would find is hot, dry asphalt. And you would have been humiliated and made a fool of for thinking it was real and chasing after it. This is the theme from last week in chapters 1 and 2 of Ecclesiastes, where he talks about how wisdom, the pursuit of wisdom, the pursuit of trying to figure everything out, trying to make sense of all of life, trying to have categories big enough to handle all the challenges and nuance of life is a mirage. Pleasure, seeking pleasure, fun, trips, enjoyment, sensuality, all of that, it's a mirage. Because if you think you're going to get it and find it and it's going to satisfy your soul, you're mistaken. And then they talked about a career, chasing after career, making a name for yourself, having some kind of vocational success. It's a mirage. If you think you can get it and that it will sometimes satisfy your soul, you're mistaken. And the writer is kind of writing, trying to get our attention, saying, wake up, pay attention. If you're just kind of plodding along in life thinking, I'm going to chase after wealth and fun and make a name for myself, and I'm just going to, just like everybody else is doing, wake up. It's not going to give you what you're looking for. It's like Ecclesiastes is coming to give us a big shove and say, snap out of it. Pay attention. Ask some questions. Where do you think you're going? Do you really think that is going to make you happy? And it's kind of flowing under the surface of all of that is the question, if your job and career and more sex and more fun and kind of more wisdom doesn't make you happy, then what will? What is there out there that will ultimately truly satisfy the human soul. This was kind of chapters 1 and 2. But today we're going to look at chapter 3, and I want you to turn with me in chapter 3. We're going to start right at verse 1. It's on page 1037. If you're using the Red Bible in the seat in front of you, look it up electronically. It's probably easier to find electronically. Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Let me read for us the first 8 verses. There's a time for everything, and a season for every activity under heaven. A time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. Now, some of you might recognize those words because they were popularized in the 1960s by Pete Seeger in his famous song, Turn, Turn, Turn. Seeger was a writer, a songwriter in the time of the Vietnam War and time of the Civil Rights Movement, and he lived with this ache in his heart that things in this world weren't right and they needed to change. And so he wrote a lot of protest songs. In fact, his manager told him one day, enough with the depressing protest songs. Write something hopeful. Write some little jingle that we can play in our cars and the people will like to sing the lyrics to. And so Seeger went away and he wrote another protest song. And he wrote this one, Turn, 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 based off the verses from Ecclesiastes chapter 3. And he tells the story that when he was writing it, he was so frustrated with everything he saw going wrong in the world and his desire to see change. He kept a little notepad in his pocket, and as he came across things that kind of captured what he was feeling, he would write them down. And then he says this, he says, I came across these verses by a tough-minded fellow called Ecclesiastes. Well, technically, they weren't by... Ecclesiastes is the name of the book, not who wrote them. But nonetheless, they're tough-minded verses that capture that life has seasons. Life has seasons. Not measured in years and not measured in days or months. Not something you can put on a calendar. But life has seasons, these experiences that define and capture this time that you and I are living in. Some of them are long, some of them are short, some of them are painful, some of them are gloriously good. And we all go through them. And if you're in one right now, it's like the weather. It will change, and then you'll experience a different one. In fact, even as I read through those verses, maybe there was a few of those descriptors that stood out to you, and you kind of thought to yourself, that's the season I'm in. That's me. That's where I am at right now. Let me just review them quickly for us in hopes that even as we're going through them, you might be thinking about, God, where am I in this season and in this list? He starts by talking about a time to be born and a time to die. We don't choose either of these. You know, it's not uncommon on a Sunday morning, if you were to listen to the announcements at the beginning of the service, for us to get up here and talk about a couple that have had a new baby. And it's not uncommon for us to talk about a family that has just experienced a loss in the run of this week. You know, in this week, we had a family give birth to a baby, we had a wedding, and we had 3 funerals, all in this 1 week. Life is marked by seasons. Time to plant and a time to uproot. Some of you yesterday or today will be hitting the garden shops. You'll be out in your shed. You'll be in the garage. You'll be getting out the pots and the potting soil, and you're getting ready because this is the season to plant. Ecclesiastes would say, great, you're going to do glorious work, your flower gardens are going to be lovely, and in October you're going to throw it all in the green bin. It'll be over. That's the theme of Ecclesiastes. There's seasons for things. A season to kill and a season to heal. In the ancient world, it was thought that it was hard to have a long life if you weren't attacked by somebody who wanted to kill you at some point. And so killing actually for some people was part of their life story. And there was times to heal. Hopefully they tried and they failed, and so you would have a season where you needed to heal from the wounds they inflicted. A time to tear down and a time to build. Some of you have a project this summer of a new deck that's going on your house, and you can't wait. Right now, your current deck has little orange cones on it, and you kind of say you can't step here. If your neighbors come over for a barbecue, you make them sign a waiver in case they fall through and injure themselves, and you're going to build a new deck, and that's going to be wonderful. And in 10 years, you're going to tear it down and have to build a new one. You're welcome. A time to weep and a time to laugh, a time for mourning and a time for dancing. You know, these 4 are guaranteed for all of us, and we don't get to choose when either. The phone will ring, and we'll get the news that someone passed away. The phone will ring, and we'll get the news that a baby was born. The phone will ring, and someone will say, guess what? We just got engaged. The phone will ring, and someone will be on the other end in tears saying, I think it's over. Life has seasons. And sometimes laughter and tears, they go together. I've been at the graveside with a family saying goodbye to a loved one, and someone say, remember how Dad always used to? And everyone will break out in laughter. And I visited with families who have had a newborn baby, and in the midst of their joy, they are weeping because they wish so-and-so was here to witness it and to be a part of it. This is life. It has seasons, and at times those seasons are complicated. A time to gather and a time to scatter. Buildings were often made of stones in the ancient world, so you had to collect rocks and bring them and move them to different places. There's a property in Manitoba that my dad's family settled on when they moved here from Sweden. And they had taken a big piece of land, and it had never been farmed before, so they had to cut down the trees and pick out all of the big rocks. And so in the middle of this property, there's this giant pile of rocks that the first family came and they kind of worked so hard in order to put them, and so the land could be useful to them. And a number of summers when I was out for vacation, my dad, the shoreline along their cottage was starting to erode, so we drove his truck out to that pile of stones, and we started to take those stones that people had worked so hard to gather, and we lugged them all the way to his property, and we secured the shoreline. There's a season for scattering. There's a season for gathering. A season for refraining and embracing. There may be seasons where your relationships are strained. A little break, a little space might be needed. And then there's seasons where you turn back to each other and say, we're going to get this figured out. There's a season to search and a season to give up, to keep and to throw away. Maybe your children have suggested some of your wardrobe. You need to apply these verses to that. There's a time to tear and a time to mend. In the ancient world, people, when they were grieving, would tear their clothes. It was such a helpful way for people to look and say, oh, so-and-so is grieving. But then when that grieving was over, they didn't throw their clothing away. They actually stitched it back up. So if you saw someone and you were talking to them and you saw that their garment had been torn and mended 2 or 3 times, you had a little bit of a sense about their life's circumstances. A time to be silent and a time to speak. Most of us aren't quite sure which of those times are which, and we do the wrong thing at the wrong time. A time to love and a time to hate. A time to be moved by love and a time to flip over the tables because of anger and injustice. A time of war and a time of peace. Some of us have family members who went to Europe to fight in the Second World War, and now in our generation we go to Europe to go on vacation. Different seasons at different times. And this is life. This is not an exhaustive list, but this captures some of the moves of the human experience that each and every one of us in this life will go through. And maybe even as I was going through that list, it felt personal to you because you've recognized this is the season that I might be in right now. So is there any hope for us? Are we just kind of adrift at sea and going to get blown here and there and kind of go through all of these experiences? There is hope. Let's keep reading verses 9 to 11. What does the worker gain from his toil? I have seen the burden God has laid on men. He has made everything beautiful in its time. He's also set eternity in the hearts of men, yet they cannot fathom what God has done from beginning to end. Verse 11 is such a powerful verse. Such a powerful verse. He has made everything beautiful in its time. He's also set eternity in the hearts of men, yet they cannot fathom what God has done from beginning to end. Let me just make 3 observations about what he talks about here, especially today if you find yourself in a season that you don't want to be in, a season you did not ask for, a season you did not sign up for. First, this idea that he's going to make everything beautiful in his time. I want to say something that might be difficult for some of us to hear, but I can't help but wonder if this is what the writer is saying, is that all seasons are God's seasons. All seasons are God's seasons. All seasons are his time. Not that he caused them, but he allowed them to happen. But all of these seasons, the ones we want and the ones we don't want, are his. They're not our time. We are living in his time. Meaning in each of these seasons that we find ourselves in, he is there with us. Your time or season of grief is his season. He is there with you in it. Your season of things being torn apart is God's season too, and he's in it with you. Your time of searching and feeling incredibly lost is his season, and he is with you in it. And because it's his time and he's in control of it, his commitment is to make something beautiful in his time from it. God is sovereign and has dominion over all of our lives, and he's working right now in whatever season you find yourself in. This is the message of the Easter story, that Christ is resurrected, that Christ is the one who resurrects. He brings dead things back to life. He brings healing to broken things. When from the weary, scared disciples who came to him all confused, who after having their faith resurrected, were willing to lose their life to take the gospel to anywhere in the world. To people who are battling for their marriage, battling in an addiction, caring for loved ones, God is in the business of resurrecting, bringing life, bringing things back together, and restoring hope. His commitment to you in whatever season you're in is to bring something beautiful out of it. And even if you're not a person of faith here today, I think we all intuitively know this. When we see death, when we see things torn down, when we see war and hatred, something in our gut just says, this is not how things are supposed to be. He even says here, God has put eternity in our hearts. Eternity is the time when God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And this is what moves the human heart. I'm guessing if I went through what reels you send to each other on Instagram, what stories you share on Facebook, what things you clip out of a magazine and mail to somebody, I'm guessing they would be redemption stories, overcoming stories, stories of the person no one's thought could do it who did it, resurrection stories. Why do these stories resonate with us so much? Because we have eternity in our hearts. We're people of the kingdom of God. We know that when Christ comes in his fullness and he is ruling and reigning, when all things are his as he intends them to be, half of the items on this list in Ecclesiastes chapter 3 will exist no more. And so we live with hopeful expectation, with eternity in our hearts, that God is going to bring about something new, even in the most challenging circumstances. Which means that we walk through life with humility, because we can't figure out how he's going to do it, or when he's going to do it, or what it's going to look like. His ways are not our ways. His plans are not our plans. I remember when we were building this facility about 11 years ago, we were still worshiping together down at Main Street. And I can remember coming up here during the construction phase. It was all walled off with a fence, but sometimes I would stand outside the fence, sometimes I would be on the hill, sometimes I would sneak around and come into the property without any PPE on and get removed. But I just remember they were busy on this property for so long before anything got built. And I would come up here and there'd be all kinds of people working on the property, and there'd be machinery and people with hard hats and all kinds of stuff, but nothing got built. And I remember one day just wanting to yell, put up a wall, put a window and a door on something, like get this thing going. Why are you spending all of this time messing around all over the property? I could not see any difference. They would be here working all day, they would leave, and it looked the exact same to me as they did at the start of the day. The people working on the project had a plan. They had a map. They had a vision for what it was going to do. and they were working, getting it ready. And I think the lesson here is sometimes the most important work God is doing is not visible to the human eye. Sometimes the most important work God is doing to us in whatever season we are in is not external, but it's internal. It's natural to question God. It's natural to say, why did this happen? And why is this happening to this person? But we must have the humility to acknowledge we cannot always understand what God is up to. If I kept reading down into the next verses, kind of 16 through 19, the writer will kind of push on this a little bit more to basically say, you and I were no better than animals. I'll just read one verse, just for your entertainment. Surely the fate of human beings is like that of animals, that the same fate awaits them both. As one dies, so does the other. All have the same breath. Humans have no advantage over animals. Everything is meaningless. If you're looking for a verse maybe to put in your card to your grandma on her birthday, maybe that'll be a nice one to cheer her up. If this verse was written today, the writer might say, in the same way that your dog cannot understand why you won't give it another treat or take it for another walk, in the same way we cannot understand God's wisdom and his plan. We live with humility as human beings, not always understanding the ways of God. So I want to go back to our list, this list of seasons found in verses 1 to 8. And if I gave you a pen and asked you to circle 3 or 4 of the words from this list that kind of capture the season you're in right now, what would they be? What would they be for you? Maybe this is something for you to do later this afternoon. Are they all good? Are they all bad? Is it a mix of both? Maybe you're in one season going into another, or you kind of feel like you're in a time of transition. Which of these would you circle? Because I want to ask you 2 questions as you think about that today that I hope will be helpful to you. And the first is this: can you see the gifts that God has given you in your season? Verse 13, the writer talks about these gifts that God gives to his people. Can you recognize the gifts that God has given to you, no matter what season you are in? Can you see them? Can you name them? I was talking to someone this week who's in a battle with cancer, and they said to me, I've discovered 2 things in this season. First, my faith is way stronger than I thought. And the second is that God has given me great friends who've been with me every step of the way. These are gifts. I watch life groups live this out as people in their life group, their circumstance falls apart, the life gets torn down, and they show up and they respond, helping them to pick up the pieces, walking with them, being present with them, gifts. We live in a fallen world, and there's so many things that we cannot control, but in each season, God gives gifts. And in the season that you're in now and the season that comes next, God will give gifts in that season too. So question 1, can you see the gifts that God has given you? Question 2, can you believe that this season you are in is God's season? This is his time. He's in it with you. He's not outside of it, waiting for you to get your act together so he will be with you. He's with you now. He is Emmanuel, God with us. The testimony of the scriptures is that God was with the people in the wilderness, with Daniel in the furnace of fire, with Paul and Silas in prison. And the testimony of many of you is that in the season of your greatest challenge, you discovered God to be nearer to you than you'd ever experienced him before. C.S. Lewis says, God whispers to us in our pleasures, but he screams at us in our pain. So what if God is right with you, right here with you now? Would you be willing to hear and see and experience his presence? Again, 2 Corinthians 4, some of my favorite verses. Therefore, we do not lose hope. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we're being renewed day by day. The work that God is doing cannot be seen on the external part of our lives all the time. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes on what is not on what is seen, but what is unseen. Since what is seen is temporary. Ecclesiastes might say meaningless, but what is unseen is eternal. Can you see the gifts that God has given to you in this season? And can you imagine this is his time? and He's there with you in it. Let me pray. God, we thank you today that we have full assurance that you are with us no matter what. And that this season or this circumstance we find ourselves in is your time. You are here with us. You are Lord over it and able to be at work in it. And God, even though there may be parts of it that we do not like, that we did not ask for, and maybe we would even say we did not deserve, we thank you that there are gifts from you for us in it. And that quietly, maybe in ways that we can't even see, your Spirit is making things beautiful in your time, changing our heart and shaping our character, making us more dependent on you. And so, God, in this season, whatever we find ourselves in, we open our hands and we trust you.